Ladies and gentlemen, it is really fitting that our hosts today, the wonderful team at ECFR with Piotr and the wonderful team with the renowned the Heinrich Böll Foundation, and indeed the city of Warsaw, has invited us to be together in this very interesting and amazing place, the theater of creativity. Isn't that an invitation for us to be creative? And that's what we want to be tonight with you today. And in fact, I would like to suggest that we transform this space into a kind of theater. After all, as the great Bard said, the whole world is a play. And we are just the protagonists in a play. All of us on stage and on the bigger stage. And I would like to suggest that our theater tonight be called the Theater of Recognition. Can we engage in a play together where we listen to each other, intensely disagree, but engage? And indeed, the name of this play today, you have it here. What can Brussels do about European values, your rule of law, its relation with Poland? Woo, that's a mouthful. So I propose to change the title of our play today and call it, anyone in this room knows Lord of the Rings? Lord of the Rings, UK. It's not because there's Brexit that you shouldn't read Tolkien. Come on. Lord of the Ring, my precious. See, the problem in our Europe today is that everyone has their claim on various things, including the rule of law, which all sides call my precious. Do not touch my precious. So the EU says, well, we're all about the rule of law, mutual trust in each other's laws. That's kind of what our community is all about, isn't it? But then you have governments like the Polish government that says, well, our rule of law is my precious. It's our democratic rights to think about how we do the law in this country. So we have a play connecting to our previous discussion about the rings of power. That's what happens in Lord of the Rings. Where does the power lay? And who has control over my precious, the rule of law in Europe and in its member states? This is what our play is about, ladies and gentlemen. And in order to have a play, well, you need the main characters, right? You need the protagonist. And so for this play, we have two wonderful protagonists. We will start with Agata, Gostyńska-Jakubowska, and was that good, Agata?
Yes, that's correct, thank you.
Agata splits herself, like most women do, between Brussels and London. She's a senior research fellow at the Center for European Reform. And indeed, she's an expert on all things European. It would be easier to cite what she doesn't do on Europe than what she does, so I won't start. But I'll simply say that she's also one of these rare species. Yes, she's a good old lawyer, but she's also, in my field, in international relations, has a diploma in both, and from the Polish Institute of International Affairs. And her opinion is highly thought all around Europe on the issues we're going to talk about. And indeed, we have as our second protagonist, Krzysztof Mazur, who I had the very great pleasure to introduce quite recently at the University of Oxford. And he's also dual because he's a political scientist and a philosopher. And he's at the Faculty of International and Political Studies at Jagiellonian Universities. But also importantly for our play, he advises the president, the president of this country, through his club, the Jagiellonian Club, one of the leading conservative think tanks in Poland, and part of this National Development Council with the president. So you see, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be a very interesting play because our two protagonists have received a mission. Like in all great plays, they interact, they want to speak to each other. They know we live in a polarized world where the likes of her and the likes of him don't always speak together. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And our role tonight is to create a space where we can have a conversation and we can escape, I hope, possibly, what I like to call the tyranny of dichotomies, that the EU has too many people who think in terms of us against them. If you're pro-EU, you're against us, or anti-EU. And where do we go from there? Now, I'm the moderator. My name is Kalypso Nicolaïdis. I'm Greek, as you can hear from my name. I'm also French. Nobody's perfect in this country. And indeed, I do allow myself to have a voice in Poland in spite of being French, because more than 10 years ago, I did write things like, do not blame the Poles, trusting the Poles, you know, and I tend to think that opinion of people all around Europe, but including in Poland, should be honored and debated among equals. So with that mindset, I would like now to simply tell you what is going to happen in our play. We'll have a first act where we are together, the three of us, and have a conversation. And then in the second act, you are the chorus or all the other protagonists, and you'll jump in not only with questions, your opinions, your comments. And in the first act, we are going to conduct a conversation a bit structured. Nothing is prepared. My protagonists will say however they want, but we will start, protagonists, with a question, an important question. You know, rule of law in Poland, within the EU. What the hell is this all about? Why is it that so many people in the rest of Europe seems to be exercised with what's happening in Poland? And why does the EU dislike what's going on? And what do you think about that? So I'd like to ask you, Agata, to start for just a few minutes, and we'll take it from there.
But first, short comment from my side. I think that it was magnificent introduction. You definitely should be a pop star, not an academia worker. And I worry that in this play, main actors would talk with less charisma than the moderator. And it's not good for a play.
The difference is the main actors have profound things to say.
Okay.
So,
thank you.
Agata.
Thank you very much, Kalypso, for this kind introduction. And thank you very much both to ECFR and Böll Foundation for having me here today. It's always a pleasure to talk about other things than Brexit. You've asked what is this fuss about, and you know, in short, this fuss is about actually democratic checks and balances, if you ask me. And to me, you know, the Polish government, ever since it came to power, it increased political influence, among others, over the Polish judiciary, which is an important element of the democratic checks and balances. It has done so by, for example, revising the way the Constitutional Court operates, making it more obedient and making it easier for a political party to push through controversial reforms. It has done it by again, revising the retirement age of the judges, by decreasing the retirement age, and which resulted in ousting almost 40% of the judges of the Supreme Court. So that's, I mean, we can go on and obviously discuss all the reforms, because let's not forget, judicial reforms is only a part of a bigger reform. But you ask why is the EU so exercised about this? I think it is really exercised about this because it worries, you know, that a court whose makeup can be easily changed will find it very difficult to remain independent. And I think what the EU worries particularly about is the implications of the backtracking on the rule of law for the European project as such. And just two examples. One of them is single market. Single market has worked well precisely because member states have trusted each other, relied that they would apply the EU rules and enforce them if necessary. So a member state that, or basically, a national court or national courts which find difficult to remain independent, or basically, if there are any actions to undermine this independence, I mean, obviously that undermines that trust. So I think that's the fundamental issue the European Commission has worried about. And you could, of course, sort of extrapolate to other areas as well. Justice and Home Affairs is another one. But that's very much in a nutshell, and you wanted me to be brief.
Well, thank you, Agata. That's quite a trial. I mean, an indictment. Krzysztof, how would you respond?
First, I would like to say that Zbigniew Ziobro is not my hero. And I'm a conservatist, but I don't support this reform. I think that after this reform, our judiciary system will be weaker, not stronger. So, if you would like to
maybe
put
you
me
can
in the
tell us
foot,
how one would support the reforms.
in the foot of someone who will strongly support this reform. Sorry to disappoint you, but everything you said is right. But I think that this struggle between Commission and Poland, it is a typical political struggle. I think that the arguments you mentioned, low arguments, it's just a tool, tools in the political struggle within the EU. I think that there are many other cases when countries behave not according to the law. A good example is, for example, Stability and Growth Pact from 2003. It is a pact when every Eurozone country should behave according to the Maastricht criteria. Mostly it is about deficit budget. And as we know, many countries, beginning with France and Germany, they many times behave not according to this criteria. And there was no sanction to these countries. So I think that law is important, but even more important is how powerful you are. And when you are not powerful enough, you have to struggle for your arguments and for your position. And I think that somehow this political struggle is because it gives benefits to both sides. I mean, for Poland, probably the calculation is that maybe it is good to have some external factors who will be blamed on other problems with our reforms. And from the Commission perspective, I think it is also a good way to show that you are powerful enough to punish, a bad pupil in the classroom. Yeah. So I think that it's a typical political struggle, and I think that both sides take benefits from it to this moment. But I think that somehow the whole process could end very, very bad. That the whole Article 7 and this nuclear option could lead to the unpredictable effects. But
can I just kindly ask you, before we jump into Article 7, and now with your interesting arguments, that is all a bit Machiavellian, that everyone has an interest in this struggle, can we stand back a bit and ask ourselves, well, okay, before being strategic politically, if these reforms in Poland are going to create such noise, are there some of the arguments by the government? Here is a peace government, now supported by 40% of the Polish population, which tells us that what it's doing is simply rebalancing an evolution, that they want to pass laws, right? And that there's going to be judges out there who are going to systematically stop these laws. Is that an argument that we should just throw in the bin?
From right-wing perspective, the argument is very simple. Just after transformation, I mean, during the roundtable talks, it was on the beginning of our transformation, leaders of the Solidarity movement, they wanted to make judiciary system independent, because they understood that in the future parliament, the majority will belong to the post-communist or post-communist parties. So the argument was quite good for this moment. Judiciary should be independent from political forces, because it's better than nomination from post-communism elites. But unfortunately, the system works in this way for the next 25, 30 years. Yeah, nobody ever wanted to make correction of the situation, and I think that that the problem who controls the controllers is a very serious problem, and there is a lot of various way to answer on this problem. And also, I think that many European countries understood that some political factors should be involved in the way of nomination of the judiciaries. In the judiciary system. So I think that it's a problem of past. Of course, the obvious argument is it was 30 years ago. You are being late. You cannot make correction now. But I think that somehow it is coherent to the whole vision of the Third Republic as a state, which is based on a bad foundation. And I think that the judiciary system is one of the part of the story, which is the identity of Law and Justice political party.
Agata, on this question of these judges, are they good old communists, problematic liberals?
Of course, one more sentence. It is stupid argument that it is still post-communist parties, but I think it's a good argument that the judges shouldn't nominate themselves. That no matter about which activity we are talking about, I think that the whole autonomy of doctors, of architects, is not good for the group, because it easily to corrupt such a system when everything belongs to the group. There is no external authorities which shows that the culture inside the group is okay.
Autonomy.
Sure, but you asked, also about the government's narrative. I think the starting point and the government's narrative is the current system does not work, we want to improve it. And what they do quite often, they do refer to the public opinion polls, where indeed the public is not really happy about the Polish judiciary. There is a low trust, and I think we have to be honest about this, a low trust in the Polish judiciary. The question is, though, whether any of those reforms that the Polish government has been conducting actually would effectively improve the system. And if you ask me, not necessarily. And this argument about the communist past, I mean, we hear quite a lot about this. I mean, if you want, we can discuss it later on, but those public opinion polls that I've looked into, one of the sort of major reason why the public does not trust the judiciary is not because there are some judges who adjudicated in the communist times there. It's just because people think that there are excessive proceedings, that it takes too long to have a hearing in the court. So I think we need to be honest about those reasons for public mistrust. And that's I think what needs to be put on the table. And then, do you actually mind if I sort of comment on what you said?
Because I would note that maybe, I mean, you seem to agree, first of all, that this communist question is really neither here or there. You may probably agree that the problem may be that people don't see that they come to trial very quickly enough. Yeah. But then Krzysztof said something else. He said, autonomy of the judiciary, give me a break, maybe it's not always very good. You know, if the judiciary is corrupt or not very efficient or have big biases or don't do their work properly, I don't want them to be autonomous, says Krzysztof. So can you say more about the autonomy question?
Well, I mean, I very much believe in the independence of the courts, and I think that's at the core of the democratic checks and balances. And, you know, if you look into the reforms, I mean, we will probably disagree over this, but I actually think that the revision of the Act on the National Judicial Council, which nominates the judges, I mean, as it stands, the council is very vulnerable to political influence, which obviously then affects the nomination of the judges. And I don't think that's fair, but what I really wanted to come back is to your argument. You know, we might not be, perhaps we might be undermining the rule of law, but there are also other member states that have been doing this. And I must say that reminds me of the argument that the Polish government has recently actually taken out of its pocket, saying, you know, there are questions these days whether if there is actually a judgment of the Court of Justice, if the Court of Justice says Warsaw has violated the EU treaties, you know, there are questions, will Poland respect the judgment? And what I hear the Polish officials or decision-makers have been saying is, well, we have a very good track record of complying with the verdicts of the Court of Justice, and there are other member states who haven't done so and who are sort of, you know, lower in the ranking. Well, but to me, it seems that this verdict, if it ever comes to that, it's about something much more fundamental. It's about whether we respect the EU values, which we committed to fulfill when we were applying for the membership or not. It's not about, you know, us failing to fulfill or sort of comply with the Waters Directive. I think it's, again, I think it's much more fundamental than this. I mean, obviously, I agree that there is quite a lot of hypocrisy in how the EU has approached those things, but I think we need to sort of differentiate between compliance with the EU regulations and compliance with the fundamental values.
Agata, can I just ask you before I let Krzysztof respond, can you tell us more precisely what EU values are being violated by Polish reform, judicial reforms in particular, that may not be violated in my country, France, or in Ireland, or in Lithuania?
Well, to me, the judicial reforms, they undermine the rule of law. And that's one of the values which is enshrined in the EU treaties in the Article 2, which Poland has committed to respect and should be respecting as a member state. Now, of course, you can ask me, how do we define the rule of law? But actually, the Court of Justice has recently done that for us. You know, the Polish courts, whenever they apply EU law or interpret the EU law, they are effectively EU courts. So the member states are actually legally obliged to make sure that the legal protection is ensured in the EU member states. I'm really sorry I'm being sort of legalistic about those things, but I think that's a very important argument to be made.
Legalistic doesn't have to be
well,
a
we
dirty
are talking
word.
about judicial reforms.
Since that's what we're talking about. But indeed, Krzysztof, that's the question Agata is throwing back at you. I mean, is there something precious, as I was saying earlier, that we call the rule of law? In fact, usually, we don't really know what the rule of law. It's a bit like oxygen, you know, you only realize that it's needed when you don't have it anymore. So the rule of law, you realize that you don't have it. Maybe you have an arbitrary administration. Maybe you fear the action of your state. Maybe corporations are not really constrained anymore. And you're citizens. Let's think about the rule of law as a citizen, in a citizen-centric way, which I think is the way we should think about the rule of law. And try to see that it's this very strange technical thing, but it actually is very real for citizens. The question becomes, is what if this is so precious, and if the EU is so concerned about the rule of law for good reasons, is it being threatened in Poland by these reforms? Krzysztof, is it?
A first short comment about different previous thing. I believe in autonomy of judiciary when there is a nomination. But so when there is a nominate, for example, in Supreme Court, president of the Supreme Court, I think that the retired of the president of the Supreme Court in Poland, it's absolutely against the rules. So I think that the autonomy here is obvious. But autonomy in a nomination, I think that it's much more complicated, and I mentioned about other countries, and I see that in other countries it's obvious that political factors play important role in the process of nomination, and it's not the case of Poland. So I would like to clarify that autonomy when there is a nominate is something different than autonomy in nominations, and I think that here I agree that some political factors should be involved. But you mentioned about you asked me about the rule of law. I think that the whole rule of law concept is a concept, a theoretical concept, which should be examined in reality. So it means that you cannot just say that there will be one bill. We establish the rule of law in Poland, and from now there is a rule of law here. We need a particular institution which will support this rule of law, which will protect the whole concept, because on the other hand there is just a concept and a theory. And we are talking about a country in the capital of which for the last 10-20 years there was a legal process of injustice, privatization of the private flats. You have to go around here, around Warsaw, and you will find 12,000 flats, as I checked, 12,000 flats, which were for the last 20 years unjustly pushed. The people who who had a right to perpetual exploitation, they were pushed out by developers, and nobody do anything with this. There is the whole literature about it. There is the whole name for it, cleaners of apartment house. And everybody knows about it. There was a left-wing urban movement in Warsaw who said that it's injustice for 20 years.
So and both conservatives like you and left.
Yeah, nobody do anything with this. And the process was that people who live 120 years, nobody ever seen them. They rent a lawyer, and lawyer came to the apartment house and say, "Okay, now I am an owner of the flat." They said, "Okay, but we have a right to perpetual explanation of the flat." They said, "Okay, but we will cut off your water or cut off your heat." Yeah. And okay, for 2 years you can live without water and without heat, but after it you moved from the flat. Yeah, and it happened in Warsaw for the last 10 years. So when the locators, you will say to them, so do you feel that you mentioned about citizens, yeah, average people, do you feel that you live in a rule of law country? What would they say? Yeah. So I have a question. Does it mean that we lived for the last 10 years in the rule of law system or not? If not, because my argument is, for sure it was not a perfect rule of law system. So if not, why European Commission didn't interrupt in these cases? Yeah? Because some particular case in the Supreme Court, from Brussels perspective, is much more important than well-being of 12,000 families in Warsaw.
Well, this is a very important point you're making, because indeed it is citizen-centric.
And I mentioned about one case, yeah? And I think that there are many other cases in Poland when people think that, okay, law is here, but we cannot fight for our justice because police is not powerful enough, because judiciary system is not obvious, not clear, and other cases, yeah. And the effect is that people treat the system is that, okay, there is a concept, but on the end of the day, who is more powerful will win in the court, yeah.
So, Krzysztof, you're making a very powerful case for telling us that, you know, in this world...
Sorry, one more sentence. Sorry for this. And
you're the boss.
The chef or vice chef of the lawyer council in Warsaw is now one of the accuser in the whole reprivatization case. So it means that the lawyers were part of the procedure. It's obvious.
So you're telling us that, first of all, Krzysztof, you're telling us that in this world, we see a lot of unjust things. After all, justice is about things being just, fair. And yet they're legal, at least in the eyes of Brussels. You're telling us that indeed there seems to be double standards. There's really bad things happening before, but nobody said anything. And you're telling us perhaps that therefore, when the EU now intervenes, when we have the European Commission starting infringement procedure towards Poland, starting a process where it will somehow legally punish Poland, that is quite hypocritical. And that you are even telling us with your last point that there are many actors in Poland who are themselves hypocritical. They're prosecuting, they're taking the side of the EU, but they were the bad guys before. So you're quite unhappy with EU intervention, and that brings us from trying to understand what's happening with the rule of law here to, well, whether or not we like or we don't like what is happening, should the EU, should Brussels, should the partner member states come in this country and tell Poland what to do? Should it intervene? And we already have a sense that you don't think that's right. Now, Agata.
In a way, I think I've already answered that question. I really find it difficult to follow, and I can't really see the direct link between all those reprivatization cases and the ongoing spat between the EU 27 and Warsaw. I mean, if you ask why the EU hasn't interfered, well, maybe because it was beyond its competences. Why is it interfering now? Well, because that affects the interest of also other member states. I mean, obviously the EU is worried about what is happening in Poland, but it is also worried about the interest of other member states. I mean, after all, the EU is, a community of 28 member states. So, if you ask, if you go to other European capitals, if you talk to businesses, they might also be concerned. So I think we have to also look at this problem from a sort of wider perspective. The Commission is the guardian of the treaty. So whenever it sees that the treaties are being violated, it should act. I agree with you that we shouldn't narrow the discussion about upholding a rule of law in the EU member states only to the spat between Warsaw and Brussels, because, I mean, obviously the backtracking on the rule of law is happening in other member states. And by the way, that's also one of the reasons why member states have been so reluctant to push ahead with the Article 7 procedure. But just to come back to your question, I think that's the question about legitimacy, right? I don't think the EU can cast a blind eye on the backtracking on the rule of law in its member states. And it's
short comment.
No, let me finish. Let me finish. But that obviously also means that it needs to take a similar stance towards other member states. I mean, you know, EU's approach towards Hungary, which did quite a long time ago what the Polish government has been doing. I mean, it's sort of a failure to act obviously didn't help, right? Because Warsaw could say, we are being singled out. And that's in fact what Warsaw is saying. The EU has no right to interfere. And there is actually quite a big public support for that, right? So I think we will probably agree that the EU needs to take a more comprehensive approach and make sure that it is not being portrayed as being biased because, for example, the Polish governing party does not belong to the one of the mainstream political parties in the European Parliament. But I hope I answered your question. I think, in short, yes, the EU has to interfere.
And
whether it will work, that's a totally different question.
Okay, and we want to ask, indeed, it's one thing to think that the EU may legitimately want to intervene, but would it be effective? And in part, what you're telling us, Agata, is that maybe it would be effective if it intervened more, and in other countries. And one question is, where do we stop? And we want to get to kind of the question of how far, generalizing beyond Poland, and what is this EU of ours, is it good for the EU? Is it good for the member states? For the EU to enter into the very internal dynamics of the member state? How far should it go? And I ask this question also as a Greek citizen. I'm French and Greek, and I definitely agree with all of those who say, well, you know, maybe we need to rethink how far the EU could go, or at least there's this question of double standards. Yeah. Poland versus Hungary.
Absolutely.
Of course, we have just seen that Hungary now has been, the European Parliament is starting to address the Hungarian issue, while the European Commission has tried to address the Polish issue. So, Krzysztof, you want to tell us whether you think that, what do you think of Agata's argument that at the end of the day, at least if there is no too much double standards with other states, yes, the EU should intervene and it's legitimate?
I think that we agree in this point, because I started with this comment that it's a political issue, and you just agree with this that EU is like a teacher in a classroom, and every teacher knows that there is one, you know, bad guy or two, so you have to do something with them, because the rest of the group, if there will be no punishment, the rest of the group will behave in the same way. So I think that's the perspective of the EU. And you mentioned about citizens. You mentioned in the previous question that the rule of law is an oxygen. We cannot see it in everyday life, but we feel sorry when we lost it. I just wanted to say that a lot of citizens in Poland, they probably, in many cases, feel that there was no enough oxygen of the rule of law in the rule of law system.
Do they think there's more oxygen today, you think?
As I mentioned in the first sentence, I don't believe that this reform will lead to the situation will be better. That's the whole problem. But I understand those who wanted huge changes because they feel that they live in an unjust system. So my short comment was, I agree, it's a political issue.
Except you say you agree, but I'm not sure you do, because Agata very passionately argued that it is legitimate for the EU to defend this precious thing that is the rule of law, which in turn is the basis for quite a few things, like the single market, like justice and home affairs, and for instance, we just saw the Irish court, but backed by the EU, saying, how can I send back a prisoner or in Poland, or how could I recognize the judgment of this court if it recognizes mine, if I don't trust that court, if it's not even a judge there now, but it's a political appointee. So you're hearing these, and this is, as Agata demonstrated, very much at the heart of the EU. So the question becomes, do you then think, but you've been telling us that you disagreed, and you didn't think it was right for the EU to intervene, even if you don't like aspects of these laws, maybe you don't believe, at least that's what I heard you say, that the EU should, that it would be legitimate for the EU to escalate the nuclear option, as we call it, of Article 7, and just for the public that may be listening to us, even outside this room, Article 7 nuclear option, it means you don't have a seat at the table anymore. That's a really bad thing. I can tell you this because I live in Britain where there's Brexit, and the biggest problem with Brexit is not loss of access to the market, it's loss of your chair at the table. So it wouldn't be the case that Poland would be kicked out of the EU, even if some people would want it, and I would think this would be horrible. But some people argue in Brussels that, you know, down the road, if this Article 7 process goes on, Poland should not have a vote, should not really sit around the table anymore. So what do you think about that logic? You were saying it's just like the teacher in a school, and it needs to point the finger. But when you make this analogy, we have a sense that you don't think the teacher should single out one or two kids, right? Do you like that kind of teacher?
I think that the situation will be changed a lot after the election to the European Parliament in May 2019. I think that the situation will be totally different, not in this legal on this legal level, but on the political level. The future European Parliament, as I expect, which will be much more diverse, much more skeptical to the Brussels, and I think that there will be no such a political tense to continue the path. Yeah, so it would show who is right in this debate. Yeah, because if because of the election to European Parliament, the situation will change. It means that it's not only a problem of legal system; it's a problem of political struggle between different forces. And the second comment is that this case of extradition of this man from Ireland to Poland. Yeah, the court said that they don't have trust to the court in which he should in the whole system. Yeah, but the problem is that this man would be judged in the same system. Exactly on the level, on the same laws, and exactly by the same judiciary as it would be few years before. What I mean is that the whole reform, the effect of the reform will be in the future. But this Irish courts say we don't trust them today. So it means that it's their perspective. It's not a problem of the system. It's a problem of how you treat some partners. Yeah, and nobody knows in Ireland how works our system for the last years. Nobody knows in Poland how works judiciary system in Bulgaria and Romania. So it's a problem of perspective. It's a problem of how elites think about countries. Not a problem how this particular case of a person from Ireland would be really finished in the Polish system. So it means that we are always talking about law cases, but the problem of perspective, the problem of opinion, the problem of trust, the problem of political struggle, they are always involved in the debate, and we shouldn't separate it and say, oh, it's just a problem of just a legal problem. It's never just a legal problem.
Well, thank you for making this statement, because before I open up the conversation to the rest of the room, I'd like to invite, well, Agata, and then in closing, you, Krzysztof, indeed, in trying to reflect what we're learning from the case of Poland, but if we want to be more positive, what ought to be done? How could the EU do this better? And especially what Krzysztof just said, which is, in the end of the day, if the EU is based on some degree of mutual trust, but mutual trust requires knowing each other. And Krzysztof, you're telling us, we don't know each other. We don't know each other's system. We don't speak each other's languages anyway, and we're not curious enough to know each other. And that's the problem with the EU. We do all these things and we don't together, but we don't know each other. So, and that's not just Poland. That's everyone. So what happens, how could the EU create a system? I spoke at the beginning of this theater as possibly a theater of recognition. If we wanted to think of Europe, of the EU, as a theater of attempting to recognize each other, meaning to know each other, to empathize, to have policies which are respectful of the others. All of these things, that's big, idealistic vision. But is there a way in which we can evolve this EU so that it gets closer to this? Or do we have to wait for the big confrontation that Krzysztof is telling us about, the next election of the European Parliament, where he foresees a big rise in Euroscepticism and an EU that hasn't changed enough for his taste? So how do you see the future, Agata?
Well, precisely because of those reasons, precisely because of the populists either already being in power in certain member states or them breathing down the neck of the mainstream parties, the EU needs to be more strategic about how it tackles the rule of law issues. And I mean, we discussed whether it's legitimate to act. I mean, from the legal point of view, yes, you can't cast a blind eye on backtracking. Yes, it needs to be more honest, that there are also rule of law problems in other member states. But it also, I think, it needs to be more strategic, because if it continues, and I might actually surprise you now with what I'm going to say, if it continues with the toolbox it has deployed up till now, I fear that actually it will fail to restore the rule of law in Poland. It might actually create a public backlash. And that's probably not what the European Commission would like to achieve. So if you look at this toolbox, we've mentioned Article 7 procedure, right? At the end, it could lead to suspension of Poland's voting rights, right? Then we have legal proceedings, very complicated notion, infringement proceedings. At the end, again, if Poland does not comply with the verdict, if it is critical of the Polish government's actions, it could lead to financial sanctions. The same with the discussions around tying up the respect for the rule of law with the EU funds, right? It could lead to suspension of EU funds. So when I look at this toolbox, I see here mainly punitive measures, which could basically antagonize the Polish public, which is overall pro-European, but as we briefly touched upon, is extremely divided on whether the Commission or the Court of Justice should tell Poland, you know, what to do. So if the EU does not complement its current set of measures with something more positive, you've mentioned this, with something which would actually, to me, increase public awareness of EU's intervention, then it will fail. I mean, it's striking that the European Commission, it thinks to me, hasn't really grasped that it needs to explain better why it is actually taking an action against Poland. If you look, there was an interesting polling again showing that majority actually of people, I mean it was only one polling, so you know, you have to see other coming out. More than 50% I think of respondents said that, you know, if the Court of Justice decided to adjudicate on the Polish case and ruled that Polish government was in breach or sort of violated the EU law, then, you know, it's the right of the court to intervene. Over 40% disagreed with this view. But then if you look into the sort of level of education of people who said, yes, the court should intervene and no, I mean, people with the lower level of education were more on the other side of the argument. So it seems to me there is some work to be done here, actually to increase the public awareness of why the Polish courts are also EU courts, of why the EU is acting, why it is not acting against the interest of the Polish citizens, but it is simply doing its job. I mean, you know, this kind of thing. And I mean, I've set out several ideas there. There is no time to discuss them. But if you talk, for example, you know, to NGOs here or in Brussels, they will tell you that they really hold it against the EU, that it has spent, for example, much more on democracy promotion outside the EU borders than it has invested in democracy promotion and rule of law promotion in its own member states. And this is bringing me to the European Parliament's elections. this shows to me basically that the EU hasn't realized that probably the most fundamental challenge to its existence is coming actually from within the EU member states, and it has written populists all over the face. So that's probably what I would argue, and this is my lesson to be drawn. I mean, just perhaps on a sort of final sentence, because I don't really want to be too long-winded. I've been reluctant for quite a long time to actually advocate any decisive action which could lead to confrontation with the Polish government, because I kind of feel the Polish public. So I think the EU needs to be more emollient about how it approaches this dispute, because as you said, everything is political.
Which is a very important point and good point to make at this stage, because maybe you're slowly converging, and maybe what we're saying here is a bit paradoxical but real. You know, on the call, your call, Agata, to some extent is about the EU in some sense being more humble when it tries to wield tools in its toolbox that are punitive, but maybe it should also be more ambitious in how deep it tries to engage with societies, because at the end of the day, the rule of law is in our head and in how citizens relate and defend it and engage with it politically. Krzysztof, is that a proposition that you would agree with, or tell us whether you think that at the end of the day, how should the EU evolve and change to take up the strategic challenge that you talked about, and what do you think of Agata's proposition?
I think that the proposition to EU Commission, European Commission, is interesting, and mostly I can agree with it. But I think that there was a sentence that the problem is that the people are not educated enough. That the people who don't support so strongly European Commission is a problem of education. Not only, okay. But I think that here is a very important point, that I think it's not a problem of education or only a problem of education. And I would like to mention about David Goodhart from Policy Exchange. You probably know him. Last book, The Road to Somewhere. He tried to describe a British society as divided into two groups. The group of somewhereers and anywhereers, yeah. Somewhereers, they are people who are devoted to the place where they live. It's important for them. They live in this particular local community, and I think that they are much more expect from national countries. That they will help when there will be a problem, as some of the speaker mentioned in the previous panel. And I think that there is a group of anywhereers who benefit a lot because of the globalization, because of the membership in the EU. They mostly live in big cities. They work for international companies. And it's very interesting that, according to Goodhart, numbers looks like half of the society are somewhereers, 20% anywhereers, and the rest is somewhere between them. Yeah, so it means that even in Britain, the number of people who are much more devoted to the land, to the particular place where they live, and who expected activity of the national countries more than EU Commission, it's a half of the society. So it means that the anywhereers, this 20%, because of their influence on media, on political system, economical system, they can, of course, better explain their vision. But I think that the system doesn't work in this way that each of this group benefits in the same way. And I think that this description of David Goodhart, when he tried to explain why there was Brexit because of the summerers who voted for Brexit, I think is very common to Poland. I think that's very similar situation. That of course there are some group who benefits a lot of being a part of the EU, but I don't really think that it's so justice that the rest of the citizens they feel in the same way. Yeah? And so maybe it's not only a problem of education. Maybe it's a problem of the
identity.
Yeah.
Can I just
and maybe indeed it's very interesting to ask ourselves about how these groups are intertwined or engage with each other. But at the end of the day, as I said myself to David, you know, there are many of us, especially in Poland, who are not one somewhere or anywhere in the world, but they belong to 2 or 3 somewheres. They're in Bristol in the UK, but they're also in Krakow.
Maybe it's this 30% of the between
Maybe that's
them.
in between. Many of us are in several somewheres rather than anywhere. But perhaps, Agata, one quick last, because I really want to now open the floor. You've been wonderful in engaging with each other, and I think it's time for us to engage with the room.
Sure. I think actually we've agreed on much more than you expected us to agree. Just a quick response to what you said. I very much agree with what you said, that we can't really sort of narrow the problem to people not being educated enough. I mean, I couldn't be more irked about arguments. You know, if people were more emollient, then they would think differently. But I think it is, and that's where you see...
the argument. If you would be smart enough, you will agree with me. It's the worst really, argument in the discussion.
No, I think the point I wanted to make is we need to be honest about trade-offs which are related with a membership in the EU. It is about commitments and it is about rights. And I have an impression that in this country, and I think we should also blame ourselves. I mean, you know, commentariat, think tanks, we haven't really talked enough about commitments. We've talked about rights and benefits. We've talked about money for infrastructure, about free movement of EU workers. We haven't talked about challenges with regards to the free movement of EU workers, for example, that it creates also a problem of brain drain for countries like Poland. We haven't talked about, you know, that the EU membership is also about respecting certain, and of course we can now probably disagree on which values, but law is a law. And this probably sort of leads us to the question, what is the European project about? And we haven't had enough honest conversation about this, neither in Poland nor in the UK. And because I spent, you know, the last several years there, I fear where it could lead us if we just don't engage in those questions.
Well, indeed, Agata, absolutely. And these conversations are so important. And I realize we have wonderful participants in the room. Some of them got blue labels and red labels, but none of us know exactly what these correspond to. But perhaps the challenge for you and everyone else who might be listening to us is that as we engage on these questions, is to get out of your comfort zone and say, well, what is it about the other side that maybe makes me think, when you come out with maybe some preconceived idea or some very strong feelings. So let's hear all of us, you in the room, and comments and questions. And indeed, not just questions, but please, your own contribution and comments.
Hello, my name is Andrzej Mendelnik-Korowicz, and I'm in a weird position of being both a question giver and one of the organizers of this conference. And I have a question to Mr. Krzysztof Mazur. Well, first of all, I'd like to do a brief reconstruction of the argument you made. Of course, it will be simplistic by necessity, but the way I understand is that the argument against interventions by Brussels is that there wasn't that much of the rule of law to be violated in the first place. The thing, you are not defending the reforms themselves, the changes to the judiciary, you're merely making an argument that things were awful before, and they won't necessarily get better. So there's not so the Article 7 procedures, etc., are much ado about nothing. Of course, I understand that this is a simplification, but you are not defending the reforms themselves. And I feel agree that there is a lot of anger in Poland about the state of institutions and the state of the judiciary. My example would be my cousin, who's a working class person, a very, very just and honest guy, who was petrified by a message from the court about an overdue debt. The case was for him to win, and but he didn't know what to do. And I can fully understand how a person who has been kicked out of his apartment can feel, how much anger can he or she feel. But my question would be that given that there's so much anger, which can be a very constructive thing, which can lead to a true reform, shouldn't groups such as the Jagiellonen Club, shouldn't members of right-wing parties, of right-wing societies, think tanks, etc., stop giving cover to this reform? Shouldn't they actually oppose it by saying to the government, this should be, of course, the work of the opposition, but it in many ways fails at it. But saying to the government, you can do better. You can actually implement a reform that that protects the rule of law, that protects the rights of the citizens, rather than just saying, well, it couldn't get any worse, so why bother?
And after all, Krzysztof, you have the ear of the president, so it's quite important to hear your answer to this question.
No, it's not. I mentioned to you before our debate that the National Council you mentioned is just. I said it directly into the press a few times. It's just an honorable group of people. There is no political power in this council. There is no way to by this council to change the decision of the president. So I think that it's misleading. You ask about lost control, give cover to this reform. I can say that we just warm up. The situation of the club 3 years ago was different. Today is different. 3 years ago, we weren't so clear about some things. We didn't have good tools to be more to express perfectly clear our statement. If you know something about this debate about new ordinatory system to the European Parliament, when we were very strongly against it, when we asked people to send our petition to the leader of the right-wing parties, when we organized a conference with the opposition leaders to ask president for veto in this case, you will see that this activity was quite clear, and we didn't give cover to anything. If we would be in the same place 3 years ago, I think that our activity in the case of, or 2 years ago, or even a year ago would be different in the case of reform of the judiciary system. It's very often it's a matter of different factors. It is difficult to explain it in a public debate. But I think that for everyone who reads our website, for everyone is obvious that we are against it. There is Jacek Sokołowski, our specialist, our expert in this topic, and I think that he gives some very strong statements in the articles or in the interviews. So I don't have this feeling that we cover this reform, and also I don't feel that we are powerful enough to block it. Yeah, so it's the problem. We just can say what we really think in this topic, and that's the reality we live in.
Politics is complicated, and I do want to encourage anyone in the room who wants to also say more about the rationale from a government viewpoint of what's going on. Yes, Piotr.
Piotr Boers, I'm afraid I cannot speak for the government, but I'm happy to share, I think maybe a sort of a clarifying remark on the core issue which has been discussed here, which is the question of does Brussels have the right to interfere in internal affairs of the EU member states in the cases like the Polish one? Because I think it has been a fascinating discussion on the panel, but I think we are mixing up three fundamental legal problems which are involved here. The one is, and this is this reprivatization case Krzysztof mentioned. This is a situation where the citizens in a country have the feeling that the judicial system doesn't deliver or are not satisfied with the rulings of the ordinary courts and want to claim against them. And there is a legal path in the European Union or in Europe. There is a European Court on Human Rights, and one can basically defer the issue at a certain point in certain issues. You can basically use this path. There is a second legal problem, which is a situation where an EU member state violates some EU regulations, and this is the case of the water directive Agata mentioned in her contribution. And then you have the infringement procedure, so the Commission can claim against the country, against the government before the European Court of Justice, and there is a legal path which can be used. And then there is a third dimension which is completely new. And this is a situation where there is a suspicion that there might be a systemic violation or systemic threat to fundamental values and fundamental rights enshrined in the EU treaties. And this is the case which basically is, as I said, new. It's the first suspicion came up with regard to Hungary, and the second one with regard to Poland. And it hasn't been any other case of this kind so far. Perhaps we will see more of that in, I don't know, maybe in Romania or maybe somewhere else, I don't know, but these are the three problems. And then, so the issue which we are discussing here is not the reprivatization in Warsaw, it's not the infringement against the violation of some water directive or another other directive, but we are asking the question, does the EU have or should have instruments to interfere in internal affairs of EU member states in cases where there is a systemic violation of the EU treaties or a threat to the foundations of the legal system of an EU member state. And here I think the novelty which we are observing these days is that apparently the European Court of Justice is ready to deal with this kind of issues. So it is a completely new thing, but that would be my argument, which I would like you to perhaps respond to it, which I think is the right way to go about this problem. Because if you disagree with that, if you disagree that the legal path is right, that basically the Commission or the Parliament, especially the European Commission, can claim against a country when it believes that there is a systemic violation of certain principles, and go to the European Court of Justice. So what is the alternative? I mean, what is the, or should perhaps the Commission or the EU institutions abstain completely from dealing with this kind of issues and say, okay, rule of law, freedom, freedom of media, whatever, is not so important, and we should not deal with that? Because I think you have stopped short of answering this question in a way. And so I would like you to basically to give a very clear answer. So do you think is this a right approach, or is it an alternative, or should the EU basically remain agnostic about whatever developments it observes in the EU member state?
I think that's exactly the message I was trying to convey, that, you know, what is happening in Poland is unprecedented in respect that the Polish government has been undermining basically EU values without violating any specific EU, you know, legislation, regulation or directive. And that's why it has been so difficult also for the EU, as we also saw in the Hungarian case, to actually, you know, pick and choose from its toolbox. And that's why the Court of Justice was not considered as a first sort of option to use. And as you know, Piotr, still, you know, within Parliament, within the European Commission, there are EU lawyers who would say that the legal grounds for this case against the revision of the Act on the Supreme Court is still sort of shaky, right? So I think that, thank you very much also for this very neat division of what we are dealing with. Now, is the Court of Justice a right address? I think ultimately, yes, because all the other paths that the European Commission has explored failed to work. So if you ask me, the Polish government could say, well, those undemocratic, but basically undemocratic technocrats in Brussels should not come to Warsaw and tell us how we should organize our system. So you could argue, well, member states, EU leaders, they have a greater democratic legitimacy. So if they tell Warsaw, well, dear Warsaw, we don't really like what you're doing, perhaps that would help to bring Poland to heel. Well, not necessarily, because the way the Article 7 is constructed basically means that we need a unanimous agreement to suspend Poland in its voting rights. And what we've already discussed, we know it's not only about Hungary, it's about other member states, Baltic countries, southern countries, worrying that if they give the Commission green light, they would actually attract its attention to what has been happening in their own countries. So I think what the Court of Justice could do is finally to halt those endless discussions in Poland on whether Poland is breaching the EU law or not, because the government's position is the EU has no right to interfere. Well, let's ask the ultimate arbiter whether indeed Poland has been doing so. And just final question, and then we will see, depending on the judgment, because we can't really speculate what the judgment would be. At the end of the day, the Court of Justice is independent. But the question is, if there was a critical verdict, how would the Polish government respond? And that's what brings us to the totally different level of a discussion. What happens if a member state decides not to comply with such a verdict?
So Agata has replied, Krzysztof, that in part it makes sense for the European Court of Justice to address this question. And I just wanted to throw it back to you, picking up on Piotr's use of the term systemic, and simply to restate what is it about the essence of the EU that makes this important. And I think one good analogy is to think about all these American series, you know, where you see the FBI come and fight with NYPD. So you've got the local police, and then the FBI comes from Washington. And there's this, you know, it's really fun, the episode, because they're fighting with each other. And you don't come to my turf, you know. But in the US, the power of the center of Washington comes into the states. On the ground, citizens see Washington, they see the FBI or whatever other powers of judges, etc., from the center. Where the EU is so different is that it doesn't have EU judges, border guards, whatever it is that represents state authority in its member state. The EU relies on the systems of its member state to apply the common law, the common rules, the commitments that Agata was talking about. So that if you don't have national systems that somehow are compatible with each other, trust each other, and are trusted to apply EU law, there is no there, because there is no European equivalent of FBI or whatever it is that the EU could do directly. The EU cannot be without compatible exercise of power by its member states. So if we agree on this question of the systemic problem, and if we agree with Agata that maybe the European Court has a role to play, or should we agree with that, Krzysztof, what are the alternatives? Since you don't really think there should be intervention, both for strategic reasons and political reasons. So please tell us what the alternatives should be.
I didn't say that they shouldn't be. I said that it's a political struggle, and I said that Commission, from my perspective, is not powerful enough to win in this struggle if the Polish government will constantly say that they don't want to implement their suggestion. But I don't exactly understand what is a precise question, because if we ask if there is a systematic threat in European Commission minds and Brussels elite minds, yes, there is. That Orban, Kaczyński is just a first step to authority system. Yeah, I think that it is, especially in some cases. If you ask me if do Kaczyński wants to make another steps to the autocracy system, authoritarian system, I don't believe in it, but I don't know. I don't believe in it, but I don't know. And I think that as long as Morawiecki is a candidate for the next leader of the Law and Justice, I don't know if it's the case, but some people say it. If Morawiecki will be the future leader of Law and Justice, I don't think that he will agree with Ziobro in this whole reform, in judiciary reform. I think that there is a huge battle behind the curtain between Morawiecki and Ziobro about it, and I think that Morawiecki is much more open for debate with Brussels in this case. It's my perspective. So I don't know exactly what we are talking about. If we are talking about perspective of Brussels elites, yes, there is a problem. If we are talking about Morawiecki, I think that there is the possibility of next steps to the authoritarian system. They are not very high. But what will be the future? I'm worried that this struggle between Brussels and Warsaw, which, as I said, is somehow benefit for both sides, someone can lost control on it, and I think that the main problem is that one day we will finish as as British society with Brexit. And but I don't think that this is a real roadmap for law and justice nowadays.
No, not yet, at least not in the short term, mid-term.
Yeah.
Can I actually very quickly respond?
I will take one last question. So, if anyone, if you can hold your
Yeah,
fire.
absolutely.
One last question, and then you can kind
There
of
are two.
reply and make a point. So let us take very short, because we started late, so we'll take another 5 minutes. But very short questions for the two of you, and then you will have the last words.
Professor Nicolaïdis, I wish you were a moderator in this kind of struggle between the Brussels and Warsaw, you know? I mean, you're doing perfect job. It's amazing. And you're able to converge views of two discutants, marvelous. But coming back to your first words concerning the possible impact of this kind of like a quarrel on other countries, and how the role of the European Commission is going to be perceived after this fight between Brussels and Warsaw. If Brussels, so-called Brussels or European Commission, wins, it will show to the rest to all member states how powerful it is. Is it capable? I mean, is the European Commission capable of swallowing it? I mean, it's going to show the power it has never been kind of like expected from the European Commission. And I'm quite curious, is it the way preferable by European states or societies for the Brussels to be?
Can you say your name?
Adam Bralczyk.
Thank you. And the last question.
Tomek Najdychor, a student at the Faculty of International Relations at the University of Warsaw. I just wanted to make perhaps a bit naive proposition. Just as someone from the audience mentioned before, perhaps this very interesting discussion has been a little bit inconclusive when it comes to the actual resolutions to the problem. But I was thinking, what if this ultimately needs a bit of or actually a really big change in the language used? Because we're constantly talking about, and these words were also used in this discussion, about Warsaw versus Brussels, Brussels elites, Poland versus the EU, also as if, you know, Poland was not part of the EU. I feel like also, I think you mentioned, you know, winning and losing in this sort of situation, as if we were, you know, in the end, you know, not a union, but some sort of, you know, conflicted group. And I wonder what you think about it. Perhaps we need to really change the way we talk about this to actually find a resolution in the end.
So two very complementary questions. One is it even in the interest of the Commission, and at least of the EU, for the Commission to become really the bad guy? And at the end of the day, perhaps a very constructive question, should we not kind of get away with from this language of Warsaw versus Brussels? Who would like to start?
Shall I start? I think because of the role the European Commission has performed, and that's being guardian of the treaties, it will be a bad guy no matter what. I mean, obviously we had this discussion about Brussels actually giving itself already unprecedented competences within the rule of law framework. I mean, there was an argument that there is no legal grant in the EU treaties for something that the European Commission, you know, for the dialogue it conducted. But I would argue, because I think your question was, would it swallow basically the amount of, you know, the powers, yeah? I think it's a bit like with the European Parliament. You get more hungry. You know, the more you eat, actually, the more hungry you get. But in this case, I would actually disagree with you. I think ultimately it is with the EU member states really to determine actually whether there is a serious threat in a certain member state of the EU values, and that's with Article 7, which has a real political influence. On language, I'm not sure actually I understood your question. I think I think we should be more nuanced. We shouldn't be. You're right. We shouldn't be. If I understood you correctly, we shouldn't be saying Brussels, versus Warsaw. But that's the simplification we use sometimes, because if I engage in a discussion about the division of powers, the sort of the balance of powers, I feel that I would lose you out there, the audience. So as an expert, sometimes I have this dilemma: should I be more nuanced and sort of, or should I be more simplistic? I actually thought your questions would be about something else. I thought that you would say, hey, hang on a second, the ordinary citizens do actually not know what the rule of law is about. And I think that's the question we haven't really tackled. Yeah. In a way, we haven't, because if you ask the ordinary citizens whether they, or maybe I am actually, underappreciating them, but if you ask them whether they actually know what powers Supreme Court has, or the Constitutional Court, or whether they really have a problem with the rule of law, I'm not sure whether that would be instinctively the answer. So I'm not sure about this. One final point I wanted to make. You said something about commissions or sort of bureaucrats' mindset. Yeah, that of course they may see that there is a problem, fundamental problem with the rule of law in Poland. But I think we need to unpick a little bit this, and it's not that the European Commission comes and says there is a systematic threat in Poland, hereby we trigger Article 7. It also draws from expertise of other institutions. It draws from the expertise of Venice Commission, also from the Agency of Fundamental Rights, which, by the way, I actually thought that it is more, it should be more involved rather than the Commission, because you can accuse the Commission of being politically biased, but I don't think you can say the same about the Agency of Fundamental Rights, but that's a topic for a totally different discussion. So I think we need to keep in mind that the Commission has, in this exercise, taken on board the expertise and analysis also of other bodies, which you can read in all those recommendations. So I think it's more nuanced than this.
Krzysztof, 2 questions, and may I say, well, I won't. I'll give you the floor.
I think that the Brussels elites, they are not loners. There are some environment, media environment in which they are act, and I think that we should say that we are partially responsible for this threat. I mean, we as intellectuals. I think that a lot of Polish intellectuals, a lot of opposite members of the European Parliament, they picture, they make this vision that Poland is on the direct path to the authoritarian. And I think that is a problem of both sides, that both sides of the conflict in Poland, we use now European Parliament as our internal factor in the internal games. So I think the best example for me, it was one of the journalists wrote an article how bad is in Poland to, I don't know, Financial Times, and then he put this link to this article on his own Twitter, said, look how Western societies looks on Poland. Yeah? And I think it's somehow it's questionable for me. So I think that's of course there are some probably good arguments, but also there is an atmosphere. We are partially responsible for it. About language, I think that our job is also to not only to create future, but also to describe reality. And I think that the future is that the language of conflict, of struggle, will be in the future of Europe. There will be more such a language, such expression, than less, as I mentioned, especially after the election to the European Parliament. So it is a problem for us, because if you would like to be clear about, to show reality as it is, we have to use this language of confrontation, because I think it's now something what happened. Yeah, it's, for me it was very surprising that Macron, in his internal French election, he used an argument that the Whirlpool factory is not no more in France but in Łódź, and we have to do something with this. Yeah, so it was the first strong involvement of Polish case in internal election of one of the most important country in Europe. Yeah, and after such an election, you cannot say, okay, don't use this language of confrontation because the future is, you should be optimistic about the future. Yeah, sorry, it's our situation now, and I think as the last sentence, I think that the main problem is that crisis of European Union is not because of Orban, it's not because of the Kaczynski, it's because of many other factors like globalization, migration, and other factors, which we are not responsible for. But the problem is that this atmosphere I mentioned before gives a great field to show us as a scapegoat for everything. Yeah, it's very easy. It's easier for example, French political elites say that the problem, contemporary problem, is because we open for those barbarians from Central Europe. They are not so Europeans as we thought. It's their responsibility. Yeah, and I think that's the main problem, that this struggle we describe during this panel give great arguments for such a narration. But I think it's not a true narration, and I think that the crisis of EU is much the factors, the roots of this crisis is somewhere in different place than in Hungary or in Poland. Thank you.
Well, I am glad that both of you, to finish off our conversation, have opened up new topics for the next debate of World in Focus, for the Heinrich, Boell and the ECFR teams to kind of pick up for next time. And I hope, ladies and gentlemen, that you'll agree with me, first of all, that it's nice that we came all the way back with one of the last questions to Lord of the Ring and the Ring of Power. Indeed, it is a burden to hold the Ring of Power for anyone who's read or seen the movies. Whether you are the Polish government or whether you are in Brussels, in the Commission, or anywhere else in the world. And we are asking how you can exercise this burden wisely. Krzysztof ended this conversation telling us, well, you know, hey guys, politics is about conflict, and we may all agree with him. But can we also agree that politics is about mixing conflict and civility at the same time? And can we say, and can we thank our two panelists for doing this for us, bringing conflict and civility together in a beautiful way? And I'd like to ask you all to join me in thanking them for having done so for us. Thank you very much.